Well, I am thrilled. What a great North Dakota turnout. Demonstrating once again that people in North Dakota care about their rural areas, care about what's happening, and want to have a voice in rural policy kind of going forward. And so for those of you who don't know me, I am former Senator and former tax commissioner, former Attorney General of the great state of North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp. And my partner in crime, Chris Sununu, who I've spent a lot of time with since we were announced as co-chairs of this commission, unfortunately got the best of some family challenges and then airplanes. So we're hoping he's going to join us later tonight when we're in Casselton having our roundtable, but unfortunately he will not be able to join us this afternoon. We're going to have two panels with a short intermission in between, and as much as we would love to hear from all of you, we will not be taking audience questions, but we think that there's an incredible level of expertise on this panel, so I think your questions just might get answered or asked anyway. So I want to start out by maybe calling on Tony Pippa, who is, he and Brent have been the brain masters or whatever, the masterminds behind America's Rural Future, this whole rural commission. And I asked him to see if he couldn't just help summarize what it is that we're trying to do, so you can follow our work. You're going to find us on social media. You're going to find us in a webpage, and we would love to have your input going forward. Just can't be in Q&A today. So, Tony?
Thank you, Senator, and thanks to all of you for being here today. And thanks to our host here at Grand Farm. It has been a hugely beneficial and enriching day so far, and so we're also really looking forward to these two conversations. So as the Senator said, I just want to give a few remarks about what this is. It's called America's Rural Future. It is a joint partnership between the Brookings Institution and the American Enterprise Institute, two think tanks from Washington, D.C., and it is a commission to look at how effective federal policy has been to support rural and small towns across the country, and how we can create a new vision for a modern rural policy, given what the future of rural communities might be in the 21st century. So we have members on the commission that come from leadership of all sectors of American life. We have former elected officials, people from the financial industry, business, academia, all over the country. Some people from the very rural places in Alaska to other people who are living in metropolitan areas, but all who care about rural and understand that the future of the country is actually strongly connected to rural America. We intend to issue recommendations for rural policy in the fall of 2027, so the commission will run for a couple of years. And we felt like to do that and do it well, we needed to hear from people in rural America in all its diversity. And so we'll be going around different parts of the country to learn, to listen, to see, and to engage with local leaders and local residents in rural places. This is our first, and we're really happy to be here today. And we'll combine it with a series of research symposia with experts to draw on the latest research around things like economic development, things like healthcare, things like workforce and automation, so that we have a good sense of what it'll look like for rural communities over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Thanks so much, Tony. And we're going to get started with our first panel. I'm going to do some quick introductions, and the panelists will have 5 minutes to kind of present their thoughts on connectivity. And at least you think it's just about broadband. It's not. It's about kind of that whole infrastructure of trying to connect people in ways that are maybe a little more challenging when you're looking at the last mile. And so our first panelist will be Todd Domres, right, Todd? Who is the manager and owner and government relations of Dakota Carrier Network and ND Broadband Association. And then an old friend, Matt McLennan, old, really old, who is the CEO of Minnesota Power Cooperative, and someone that I spent a lot of time with when we were looking at how we could, in fact, continue North Dakota's energy opportunities. And finally, we have Bob Henderson, who's the Chief Information Officer of Cass County. And so, Todd, can you kick us off with maybe 5 minutes of talking about the opportunities and challenges you see in this space?
Yes, thank you, and pleased to be here on behalf of DCN, Dakota Care Network are 13 rural broadband provider companies that own DCN. Those are the companies that serve the entire.
Can everybody hear in the back?
The entire geography.
Okay.
Okay, the entire geography of the state. I can hold this thing like this.
That might be better.
This is old hat for me. I do some radio and live stream broadcasting, so this will be perfect. Yeah, and so those companies are the 13 rural broadband providers that serve the entire geography in the state, and that provides a canvas about what we can do as far as broadband. So the question I get asked a lot is, how does a state like North Dakota that has 800,000 people and 70 some odd thousand square miles be number one in a lot of internet and broadband connectivity things, number one in access to gigabit internet, first in the state or the nation to have K through 12s all with a gigabit connection to their school, and just numerous success stories like that about being the crown jewel of internet in the country. How do we get there? It was a huge investment. There was some founding fathers and mothers years ago that had a lot of influence on how we got to this point, and recently it's been millions of dollars, $100 million annually is going into the ground in fiber optics in North Dakota. That's $1 billion investment in the last decade that has gotten North Dakota to this point where we're recognized. And now that foundation has been laid. And now you have a position where we go to chamber events across the state and you start talking about policy, you start talking about economic development. The question isn't, do we have broadband availability? It's there. How do we make use of it? And what are the other issues we got to solve? And there are certainly issues to get around, but the foundation is there. It allows us to now turn our attention to how do we best put that infrastructure to use. I see the folks from Vantis and the Grand Sky and the Northern Plains UAS Test Center. So drones is a huge area. Precision ag is a huge area. We got a developing market in the state with AI and hyperscale data centers coming. Our infrastructure is well suited to serve that, and we're certainly proud of it. It is not in our North Dakota DNA to brag about it, but broadband and what has been built out in our state is certainly something that we like to brag about.
Great. Thanks so much, Mac.
So, Mac McClendon, I'm the CEO at Dakota Power, and so if you think about the eastern half of North Dakota, the western half of Minnesota, and the rural communities, so the electric cooperatives, we would be their power supplier. So as I think about the question around rural connectivity and what do we do with respect to, at least in my space, how do we get rural infrastructure, how do we get electricity, how do we assure it's there? We obviously start from a very sound position that all the way back, Tony was asking me right before I started, I mean, clearly we had an advantage in the Rural Electrification Act in the 30s that established a foundation. So we start from a spot fundamentally that we had a foundation that delivered on our ability to get to every farm from a rural perspective associated with electricity. And so as I think about where do we go from here, is what happens to the expansion of that? What are other opportunities? So what happens with respect to agricultural development? And I've got to reserve comments on AI because I can't fathom that we're not going to get questions about that here momentarily, but I'll make some commentary about that and where does its role develop as we go forward. But it's also trying to figure out, and I'll call from an economic development perspective as we move forward, what's the combination between, I'll call it the digital world, so Todd's world, and mine as it relates to how do those come together to be able to ensure that we can build out, if you will, incremental or additional opportunities. And so I think from a utility perspective, we feel pretty good about where we are. That doesn't mean we don't have to make infrastructure investments still in our part of the world, but I think if you take what, at least where we live, the work that's been done on the connectivity side, on the, I'll call it the telecom side of the world, that which we already have, I think, in the electric side of the world, we are probably well ahead of our opportunity to participate in whatever comes next beyond where some other parts of it are. Now, if you said that same thing to some of the very rural parts of, so if I went to right up by the Canadian border for our system as an example, you would have a deficit, right? There are deficits that exist, but they are relatively isolated, at least in our neck of the woods as it relates to the ability for connectivity. And that's not true on the telecom side. You guys have assets up in the northern part of the system that fundamentally they can reach that we would have a little bit more of a difficult time with. So I'm actually relatively bullish on the opportunities that we have in this region, but they are created from a lot of investments that happened a long time ago and have continued to happen over time. They also are, and again, I think we maybe are not unique in this, but certainly we have practiced it well, come from the idea that people end up fundamentally working together, right? So we co-own a power plant with a number of individuals. We have relationships with a number of individuals. We co-own transmission lines with individuals. And so we have developed, I think, an architecture because people were willing to work together, partially as a function, frankly, of it's expensive to serve rural communities, as everyone in this room knows, just from a geography perspective, if nothing else, right? So I'm bullish on what the opportunities are. I will clearly talk a little bit about what I think the opportunities are. Todd reflected it in the northern part of our system, Grand Sky and UAS and all the things that are happening around that, and down here what's happening as it relates to Grand Farm and precision agriculture and all of those pieces. And every one of those things are going to need both a combination of what the telecom world brings to it and then what we bring to it from an electric infrastructure perspective as well. So happy, I think, to just answer questions for the most part about where we are, and I will talk specifically. Heidi asked me if I'd make comments on AI. So if someone doesn't ask me, I'll just take the mic back here at some point and talk specifically about what's going on with respect to that here momentarily.
Thanks, Matt. Bob?
Well, that's the best part about going last. They've already said everything I plan to say. From a telecommunications and a power perspective, North Dakota is an example for the nation. We have tons of both. We have put in efforts, collaboration, and a true spirit to keep growing these things for the benefit of our citizens, our businesses, and the state as a whole, which really shows just how much effort has been taken from our founding fathers and mothers all the way up to today as we keep investing in that. Where I focus from, coming from small local government, is more focusing on what we can do for the citizenry so that we are able to take advantage of some of these benefits that are already there, that our taxpayers are already funding, and what we can do to help continue that growth while making sure we're doing it in a safe, secure, and sustainable methodologies. I see we have real 4 strong priorities to look at here. One of the biggest ones for me is finding and keeping that talent for all of these industries, for these new developments, for these data centers springing up, for all of the agencies that are growing upon this great infrastructure foundation, and keeping them locally. Right now, I don't want someone going to one of our great colleges and migrating out to Illinois or Los Angeles or somewhere else. Finding solutions that we can help leverage these and keep growing these industries from ag tech and beyond is critical to keeping our industries growing, which we have seen through a large amount of investment from various member companies and the continuous growth we see, including the building we sit in here today. Finding more solutions like this will be critical for us. Second one I have on there is really what we already have in place, is continuing that telecommunications and energy partnerships. Working together for these things to grow, as we're talking about co-ownership of transmission lines, making sure that as we grow out in new communities or new areas, we are building to them for these solutions. Allowing connectivity to almost be an assumption, knowing that there can be connectivity there or it's coming very quickly, allows us to grow in some of our more rural areas. When I grew up, everything was measured in distance. How far was it to school? How far was it to the doctor? How far could I get away before my parents thought I ran away? It didn't matter. It was all distance. With proper broadband deployment, with proper connectivity, be it fiber or fixed wireless or satellite, whatever it ends up being, distance starts to shrink. And there's no reason that we can't have a top-of-the-line enterprise solution here in Casselton or in Page or Air or any other part of Cass County, doing industry at a global level, because our physical location is a benefit, not just a drawback. Finally, one of the most important ones, and I'll caveat saying I am not a politician, I'm an appointed CIO, so when I say the word policy, I'm talking way above my headspace. But we need to have some smart policy guardrails put in place. Our citizens deserve to have a say in what they live and where they live and what kind of industry is there. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we're not being reactionary. It is critical to involve local voices at every step of these policies and procedures so that those local voices have a chance to be heard. Not saying that anyone should dictate a conversation or roll over anyone else, but involving them at agencies such as this, in communication as we develop new technology and hearing what the needs are from our citizens, to me is very critical as we continue to grow this. Our citizens are the ones who will be building the companies that we're wanting to take advantage of this connectivity. They will be running the businesses that are supporting my job as a tax-funded individual. Making sure they have a voice that is listened to, respected, and understood is critical. At the end of the day, though, my biggest thing on this is not to pat ourselves in the back, but we've been doing a heck of a good job here in North Dakota. We're number one in so many things you can't keep track of it anymore, and not all of them are just football teams. We need to keep that momentum going. We need to keep that momentum strong and growing so that we don't sit on our laurels and end up looking back 10 years ago and go, what happened? That's all I've got.
Thanks so much, Bob. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question. If you have a question, if you could move your name tag and stand her up on end, and I'll call on you in the order that I see them go up. But one of the things that we're doing here is really examining federal policy, and pretty much every one of you talked about the value of the investment that you've seen over time. Can you tell me, where has federal or state investment worked particularly well, and where has it come with too many obstacles, or what concerns you kind of going forward about federal or state policy? Let's start with you, Don.
Yeah, I'll start with that one. So federal and state policy has been critical to the broadband build out in the state, whether that's universal service or some of the programs such as Reconnect or BEAD or the NTIA grants. Frankly, when you have as many square miles as you have subscribers, the cost model just doesn't work in the rural areas. It works in the towns and the metros, but you just don't get to everybody with the connectivity that they need to not be on the wrong side of the digital divide without those programs that were started many years ago, again, by those folks that had the foresight to think through, okay, how are we going to do this so we don't create something that is backwards? And I think the other comment that I'll have is broadband has gotten to the point where I think it was Brad Smith from Microsoft that said it is the fourth essential utility. And really, we believe that. And in many respects, whether that's electricity, water, heat and gas, and now broadband is the fourth essential utility. I don't know about you, but in your house, those other three can go off, but if the Wi-Fi has a problem, we are having a bad day in the Domres household. So we have now entered a position where it isn't just a nice to have broadband and internet connectivity. It's a requirement to be able to function and do business. That's also why we spend so much time about resiliency and redundancy, and we'll get into that, I think, in a little bit in that AI discussion.
Okay. Mac?
Yeah, I would say initially that the single greatest thing maybe as it relates to where has federal or state policy worked is in, at least in our case, initially starting up and then being mindful today. It's much better today than it was once in the past, but is affordable capital. So if you think about our access, for example, to USDA for affordable capital, as you think about the amount of dollars that we're talking about spending, and we have lots of solid alternatives. Tom's here today to talk about it from a co-bank perspective as well in terms of alternatives beyond that, but things that were done right, which allow us to be where we are, I would argue that access to affordable capital has been one of them. The second thing that I think has been from state federal policy, which I would argue to today is completely upside down, so it's not helpful, but has been some stability in the recognition that we build 30 to 50 to 60-year assets, right? So you haven't had those assets being dramatically impacted around their ability to operate. I would say, Heidi, as you well know, I mean, the last 20 years, that stability has got worse, and I would argue to you today it's maybe at its all-time low with respect to trying to figure out what decisions do you make around making $billion-plus investments in power plants, regardless of what the power plant is. And so I think that level of stability from a state and federal government in terms of recognition of those assets has been, if you will, one of the positives that is really at risk today.
One of the things I've loved from our federal partners is the more recent realization that building assets and connectivity is a fantastic aspect, but being able to have the people that are using this actually be able to do so in a sustainable way, as well as a secure methodology. North Dakota has been gifted in this due to the partnerships with DCN and StageNet, which is our large public-private partnership for broadband. We've been able to utilize funds through the state local cybersecurity grant program available to all of our state local townships, our cities, our K-12, our tribal institutions to make sure that we are able to keep up with the rapidly changing technology. To date, we have given over $8 million, particularly locally here in North Dakota, to make sure that we are maintaining the cybersecurity needs to protect our citizens, our students, and our businesses, with over $1 million of that going to Cass County specifically. Keeping those kind of partnerships and that kind of growth included is very critical because technology is such rapid development. We need to make sure that as we expand to AI hyperscalers or pick whatever other acronym you would like, we are doing so securely so that our environments are protected, so at the end of the day, our citizens can sleep soundly knowing their data is safe.
Thanks.
I'd add one thing, Heidi, maybe a third to your question is that, and this is on the policy side of recognizing the value of helping in early technology development. Right, that is a role, I think, that historically has been valuable from a state, federal policymaker perspective, or even an early investment. So you go back, Todd talked a little bit about kind of those early first movers. I know there are a couple of state legislators in the audience. I would say the work the state has done recently to try to figure out how do we get gas from the west side of North Dakota to the east side of North Dakota. Those things become valuable in terms of trying to figure out how do you advance. So, and they're fundamentally not, if you will, and I go back to affordable capital and some of these others, these are not things where you're just giving money without a return, right? Or you're not getting a return back on it. So when I talk about access to capital for us, we pay it all back. It's just affordable in the sense against, say, where we might get it from the market vis-a-vis Wall Street or others from an affordability perspective because of the difficulty in rural communities.
Tony?
Yeah, and maybe it's for Todd, but you know, you mentioned like Reconnect, USDA's Reconnect. You mentioned NTIA and BEAD and Universal Service. All those things, though, they're available to other states as well. And so I would just love to hear more of the story of, you know, how does North Dakota like do this and get it done versus other states who also had access to some of those same programs and, you know, and for better or for worse, however efficiently they work or don't work, you know, you've been able to actually, you know, get it done. Like you say, you're sort of number one in everything. So just giving us a little bit more of that story, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I'm happy to answer that. So those mechanisms, and whether that's USDA or those funding programs, those aid in the conversation, right? But there's still an immense amount of private investment that goes into that. And one of the reasons that North Dakota is ahead of the curve here is that those investments and those decisions were made by local folks with local ownership, cooperative principles, and with the mindset of putting those members that are maybe off in the North 40, putting those members first in every one of those decisions. When those decisions are farther up in the corporate chain and maybe even out-of-state influences, those aren't the same investments that are made as they are when those decisions are more on a local level. And I would say that that is one of the primary, if not the primary reason why North Dakota is ahead of the pack here when it comes to broadband in our state.
And I'd like to add on to that. In partnership with growing with the public sector here for that, a big investment from the state of North Dakota made to their locals that are of a much smaller population. In addition to getting this connectivity to all of our more rural areas, the focus on providing high-speed broadband, usually in direct partnership with DCN, to all of our K-12 schools, our cities, our towns, and enshrining that within Century Code was solely a stroke of genius, because we're making it effectively practice that we will provide connectivity. We will provide that connectivity at a market agreeable rate. You get it. And that's not something we see in many other areas where if you're down in southern Florida and we're looking into more of a swampier area and it's difficult there, you can have those discussions saying infrastructure is hard. Infrastructure is hard, but North Dakota spirit is harder. And we make sure that we've invested that we will reach everyone who wanted to be reached. And we continue investing in that day after day, which is a huge benefit for us to hit these #1 marks.
Yeah. I want to maybe add kind of a story, because I've been at this a long time. In the 1990s, we were talking about the digital divide. We were talking about what that would mean if we weren't connected the way we needed to be connected. And it was interesting because when I ended up in the Senate, I would hear you know, my colleagues talking. I started the rural broadband task force with Shelley Capito, and I would hear members saying things that we were saying in the 90s. And I just want to give a shout out to Byron Dorgan, because he was one of the first people who introduced that concept, and on a bipartisan way, people said we are not going to be left behind. But I want to reiterate what Todd said, which is the value of that co-op method, the value of the co-op, you know, kind of belief system, which is we are here for the members, and when the members own it, it's a little easier to make the decision about adaptation. I'm going to take a prerogative, Phil, and call on you, because we had an incredible conversation last night, not just about the infrastructure, but utilization of the infrastructure. And so if you could just add, you know, kind of talk a little bit about what we talked about last night in terms of utilization, and maybe challenge these folks to think about that additional challenge. Just building it, you think they'll come. It's not always what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works now. Hello.
Hello.
There you go.
Hi. I mean, like during COVID, you know, there's another effect attempt by the federal government to encourage more connectivity to be available across different pockets of the U.S. I know 2 of the 3 major telco providers directly, and one of the things that they bristle on is like, Philip, this is not the first time that the federal government has encouraged us, to build more connectivity. But every time we build stuff, no one's using it. Who is taking on responsibility to figure out the last mile adoption? Like, if I am a farmer today, what does it mean for me to be on the internet? Is it going to help me save my pain points? Is it going to help me save time, save money, be less stressed? Is that an app? Like, how would that be manifested? I do think that there are a lot of training programs that are meant to increase the digital adoption and engagement, by folks from different communities. But you're talking about an entire population where, out of habit, they're not online. They may have a smartphone, but people aren't just using Google Calendar, to meet up with one another, right? A lot of these things are still very much analog. And I actually think that, from a technologist perspective, it's more our responsibility to get these technology closer to people. So I would say that, one thing is more like, you guys can challenge technologists, to think harder about how can your tool from here or from Silicon Valley or whatnot, how is this meeting the needs of my people? If they don't have a clear answer on that, so we'll give them the sandbox, to actually do something about it. Because that last mile bit is going to be a question, that we need clarity on. Thanks.
Comments?
I'll take a quick one here. We mentioned North Dakota's got great broadband availability and connectivity. There's still a few places to solve, and working hard with the North Dakota Broadband Office, and we believe in the next 18 months, North Dakota could very well be the first state in the union that has fiber optics to every serviceable address in the state. So that will be a huge milestone, and one that we would celebrate. But to Phil's question, that just gets it there. How is it adopted? How is it utilized? Where do the challenges reside then? Number one, is it affordable? And I think those are key questions, right? Because you can only do so much to get it there. And then, is it affordable? Is it usable? Do we have the training mechanisms to enable people to adopt it? Great story for me to tell is my dad grew up on a 5th-generation farm a couple hours north of here. And he's just recently retired, and he decided not to have an auction sale. He was so enthralled with the fiber optics that United Communications brought to his farm. He sold his entire set of farm equipment online, and he was so proud of
old is
it.
your dad?
He's 80 years old. Yep, and he was like, heck with an auction sale, I'm just going to do this myself. So you talk about adopting technology at somebody in a later stage of life. I think about a K through 12 initiative that we have in North Dakota, another public-private partnership. We're adopting cyber education into kindergartners, and just developing that mindset of using technology, doing cyber things like Tony said. And so I think those education opportunities are still untapped. For broadband providers, we can certainly do it, and anybody else that can aid in the cause there of helping us adopt broadband and make it affordable.
Bob, do you have a comment?
You're 100% right that we can't make people use it. And part of that is really circling back to the idea of desire paths for onboarding. We need to figure out, by discussing with our citizens, by talking to the people, to determine where these pain points are, versus creating a tool and saying, why wouldn't you want to use this? I mean, I'm not a big fan of Google Calendar myself due to various reasons, but if I have to use it, I can. But for many of these people with their first blush at journeying into technology, if they hit that existing roadblock and it doesn't fit their needs versus the need that they're being told, they're simply going to abandon it. So part of that really comes back to the collaboration we've hinted at before of listening to our partnerships, listening to people for what these actual needs are, and then that ongoing investment, either from private or public funding, to help develop tools that meet those needs. By having the fiber there, we are ready for that connectivity, and what I really am excited about is the 80-year-old farmer who's been doing this for 40 years, and he's just got a great idea in his head that he's never been able to figure out due to connectivity issues or whatever else. Once they come up with these ideas, potentially leveraging newer tools such as AI to help them develop this infrastructure themselves, that is where I'm excited for the growth. Because we're solving problems that we don't even know we have with these new tools that all rely upon that connectivity and power availability to be able to implement.
Yeah, John Day.
Thanks. I had a similar I'm thinking about Don's question as well. So are other states coming to you to ask how you've done it? I'm sure people are looking at these league tables that you have, and there's healthy competition between the states. So I'm sure others would want to be number one too. So are they coming to ask?
Oh, you got that right. We've had multiple discussions with other states about how did this model work in North Dakota and how were you able to do it. And what we've found is what made DCN successful and what has made our owners and those rural broadband providers and the Broadband Association of North Dakota successful was we covered the entire geography of the state. Other states have pockets of exactly what North Dakota has, but they don't have it from end to end and corner to corner. That buy-in and that shared responsibility and some early minds back in the 90s when a statewide type of network like DCN was formed, those were huge decisions and allowed us to kind of get ahead of that curve. And then equal ownership and decision-making has allowed us to maintain that and thrive in many respects. But we get asked to talk to a lot of states about the DCN and the North Dakota model.
Trent?
Yeah, and so this has kind of been touched on, you kind of did here, but pointing out an elephant in the room, the rural versus urban divide. And want to talk about two kind of questions here. One, how are your business models different from your city cousins in the same industry? And then second, kind of back to question from Tony, and then one of your benefits is your what I would call an entirely rural state. I'm from Texas. We have more rural residents than you do in North Dakota, but we have Houston and Dallas to contend with, and they don't really care if we have rural electrification or anything, broadband or anything out where I'm from in a county of 1,200 people. So does that give you an advantage here because you don't have to combat that? And what advice would you have for those states like next door, Minnesota, that is mostly rural, but then you've got Minneapolis, St. Paul. So just kind of commenting on that rural, urban, on both those aspects.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a little bit of a shot at it is that maybe one of the differences for us versus where you are is that we don't necessarily end up in any portion who isn't somewhat reliant on rural. So if I take your Houston, Dallas, they can exist without rural. A part of Fargo has to be tied to what's happening in the rural communities surrounding it or any other of these communities. And so you end up with an interdependency regardless of your business model because our communities are, I call it, have to coexist, right? So we don't have a metropolitan area, at least in this, and I would argue Western Minnesota. So someone asked me at lunch today a little bit about what I call the divide of the river, because half of our load is on the Minnesota side, half is on the North Dakota side. And clearly, from a political perspective, when you color one state blue and one state red, and you can find some very differing policies between those two states to operate in if you're a business like us. But the reality is the western side of the state, you would have a hard time depicting the difference between one of my members on that side of the river than you would on this side of the river. But maybe very different when you got down to Minneapolis. And so in Minnesota, you might find a little bit more of rural-urban divide because Minneapolis, frankly, can survive without rural communities, right? Fargo would have a difficult time doing that. Bismarck would have a difficult time doing that. Grand Forks would have a difficult time doing that. And so that's one of the reasons maybe is there's a level of interdependency. And if you take us in particular, all of the rural areas around Fargo are served by the rural electric co-op and the center by an investor-owned utility. So even there you have interdependencies where we co-own facilities together, share facilities together. So at least in our space, that's the case. I would say back to your business model, there's a little bit of that is obviously, Heidi touched on it, Todd touched on it as well. The cooperative business model gives us a bit of an advantage, if you will, in terms of kind of taking care of everybody within whatever your defined footprint is. So you end up with kind of a shared set of responsibilities that help with some of that as well, defined by our business model. Like I'm not for profit. Like I don't figure out every day how I get up and now obviously I make money, right? Or I wouldn't be successful in terms of being able to invest capital, but my motivation isn't to get up every day and make money.
Yeah, I think from a broadband standpoint, North Dakota is lucky in some respects. The metro areas, I would say, are highly competitive. Cable company and even the Fargo Metro, there's 5 or 6 very good fiber optic, in some cases cable, coax, if you will, broadband providers that that competition just is there because there's an ROI in those metro areas. You have the number of subscribers to support a business model of building out and making an investment there. So that there's companies willing to do that, and that is the benefit of all the subscribers that live in those areas. The contrast to that is in those rural areas. I mentioned my folks, they live in a township where it's 36 square miles and there's 32 customers there. So that is a harder business model to solve, obviously from an ROI standpoint, but those are the ones that I believe that North Dakota has solved. And in some cases, folks like my parents have better options for internet than some of the people do in the urban areas. So in North Dakota, it's almost, I believe, flip-flopped in some respects about that urban-rural conversation, and I think we're probably lucky that way.
Yeah. I tell a story about a service provider that was private, not a co-op, and one family lived across the road. It was a rural road, and they put a trailer house on the other side so they could get the co-op broadband. It was that much better. Noah?
Thank you for being here, but also thank you for describing what has worked with federal policy. Curious if you could talk a little bit about what more can be done, or looking into the future a little bit, what you think would be helpful to maintain the momentum that you've had to date.
Well, the obvious big one, what may not be exactly helpful, is more non-funded mandates. If we get more rules to do such a thing without funding or anything tied to it, funding has to come from somewhere. And that is where we find difficulty investing in new growth and maintaining what we have if we continuously get new changes of you shall do this and I don't care how you pay for it. That is one of the biggest ones that hold us back, but also making sure that we don't have any kind of impacts to our collaborative structure. As we said repeatedly up here, we come from an agricultural background where it was normal to go help your neighbor. If someone needed their snow plowed, we helped them out with that. We took care of each other. And that has grown into our business models across many of these while still maintaining profit margins. Once we start having any potential impacts into that model, which we've really built upon, that's going to be bad for North Dakota. So we want to make sure we can continue doing the great things we've done without that level of impact.
I think the one futuristic challenge, I believe, is, as I mentioned, we're getting close to having North Dakota with fiber optics to every serviceable address, working through some mapping things where they think a hay bale is a serviceable address, but really we're not going to build fiber to a hay bale. But so we'll get to that point. But then the conversation often becomes, all right, you did it, and let's just wipe our hands, and we've made the investment, let's go. Well, that is so far from the truth that we have to continually educate people that, yeah, that glass and fiber optics is in the ground, but it takes electronics on each end of that, and the demands keep growing for those electronics. And so while that investment is in the ground in many cases, and that glass is there, you always are continually upgrading those pieces of equipment that light that electronics and moves that data at the speed of light. So that is, I think, the one challenge, whether that's inflation, access to capital, other things that just, you need to continue to maintain those networks even though a great investment has been made.
Yeah, I would say the greatest thing we could do today is provide some stability. I said this at the outset. If you think about the long-lived nature of our assets, right? Our power plants are 50 years old. Our wind farms are now going on 25 years old. What I would call the pendulum swinging as it relates to kind of the flavor of the day for what do we want to power the country with becomes really difficult to manage, right? So stability associated with, just give things a chance, right? I mean, I say this frequently. I don't want to offend policymakers in the room, but I'm going to, which is we have policymakers who work on 2-year cycles or on 4-year cycles or even on 6-year cycles, and I spend capital on a 40-year cycle, right? So as we think about, what does federal policy look like going forward, some level of stability. And it's going to get even more difficult, I think, as we talk about, so we are in what I would describe in our part of the world or our part of the business, an unprecedented time. So for decades, back to the 80s, electric growth or electric load growth is, let's call it 1%, maybe 2% in the country. And if you look at the forecast for today, they are like near straight up, right? And so trying to develop $1 billion+ infrastructure projects in a fluctuating policy environment that has to last 45 years with the mindset of a 30-day policymaker is near impossible. Right? And I don't say that to be critical of policymakers, and I'm not saying that because, and I would say that to you is true. I'm catching up with Heidi really quickly here, and I'll be I'll be nonpartisan, but beat both parties up at the same time, which is it's the pendulum, regardless of the side. It's the moving that hurts us, right? The moving of that pendulum. So when I talk about stability, you can't have it keep moving, whether it's moving left or it's moving right. Not being critical of either again in the midst of it, but it's a recognition that we are in a business that needs stability, and the amount of investment that has historically been made and is going to become dramatically more important as we think about load growth that we haven't seen since the 1970s.
Wow. Tom?
Yeah, it's encouraging to start out in a place where there's been visionary leadership for a long time, as we've heard, ranks you very highly on the metrics that we're talking about here. My question is a little bit a different version of a same question, which is, these are massive capital investment projects and capital intensive industries, everything in infrastructure, right? And so as you think about the visionary leadership that's required for the next 10, 20, or 30 years, separate and distinct from federal government policy or state government policy, what, simply put for each of you, what are the ranked order top 3 constraints that constrain the ability of the key decision makers to do what needs to be done to deliver the kinds of outcomes in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time that you think that the state and the people here need? Top 3 constraints.
I'll fire away first on this one. Great question, by the way. So in a lot of respects, our state has operated off of an infrastructure model that was, in some cases, those fiber optics have been in the ground for 30 years. And we just put, as I said earlier, different pieces of electronics on it. And that has served us extremely, extremely well, whether that's K through 12, drone, precision ag, higher ed, you name it. That model has absolutely positively worked. Now in the advent of hyperscale and AI data centers coming down the turnpike, that model is challenged from the standpoint of one hyperscale AI data centers coming to the plate and asking for a 432 count of dark fiber just for one customer. We've ran our entire network for 30 years on 2 fibers. Now one customer is asking for 432. And that's just in one segment on the state. This is exploding when you've got up to, as mentioned to Heidi earlier, by our count, about 15 AI or hyperscale data center opportunities across the state that are in different stages. So you can about imagine the infrastructure challenge of trying to figure out, okay, how do we invest what could be a couple $100 million project onto something that is a bit prospective yet, not get the cart in front of the horse, have the capital, have the funding, who's going to pay for it? Are the data centers going to pay for it? Is there going to be some public-private investment to get there? Well, that is a huge challenge. Just it goes side by side with the power challenges of the megawatts that these outfits are asking for. They also are asking for an immense amount of fiber that in many areas does not even remotely close to exist.
I would maybe add just a couple of things. I think, Tom, one of the constraints is what I would describe as the misalignment of the installation of that capital and the use of it, right? I don't build a transmission line one wire at a time. I don't build a power plant 10 megawatts at a time, right? To build an efficient, cost-effective power plant, I might fundamentally need to build 500 megawatts, but that 500 megawatts is $1.5 billion, and I only need it 10 megawatts increments at a time over 20 years. And so you find yourself significantly, because of time, upside down. Right, and what happens to your rates is, as I think many people well know, is we spend that $1.5 billion and your rates go up dramatically, and then again they flatten out for a long period of time again. And so one of the constraints is, and it's not a different model than it's ever been. It's the way it's always worked. It's no appreciation societally that that's how it works. Right, when I tell you I need to raise your rates 30% tomorrow for a set of infrastructure. But if I run the curve and show you what my rates look like over that 40-year period, I've gone up less than the rate of inflation, but if you happen to be the individual who's in charge of whatever you're upset over, the day I give you the 30% rate increase because of a misalignment of time against use, I'm the worst person you've ever seen in your life, right? So I think one of it is that our infrastructure doesn't lend itself to small increments at a time that build up. Your most efficient is to build your best asset and then to grow into it, and that is, I think, one of the constraints or challenges of misunderstanding of how does infrastructure work, right, to your point. And then I think that the other thing, and if we use AI as the example, is getting people to understand, because I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here as well now, what are the value of those investments? So as you think about kind of where does that come back, the value of those investments in AI in particular, I heard it a little bit when I came in earlier as people are trying to figure out kind of how do you use the data network side of it to produce something that creates more value. I think we have created this misunderstanding about what is an AI center and what is data value, right? And I think about that as it relates to North Dakota is an export state. We don't have enough people here to use all the things that we do, right? So we send everything off, including a lot of power that we sell to different places, and certainly we don't consume all the soybeans, corn, and canola, and every other crop that we produce in this state, right? And so if you think about an AI data center being a manufacturing facility that you're going to export, all you really have to do is get your mind around the idea that product you can't see. No different. You produce a job, you produce a building, you produce an asset, you produce a value, you produce everything that happens. You export a large portion of it, you use a large portion of it internally, but it is fundamentally a manufactured piece of data that has value. It's just not a gear or a wrench or a combine or from a Gwenner, it's a skid steer, right? It's not one of those, but it has tremendous value as we think about what are people going to use for tools in the future. And if the tools that you use in the future are data, then an AI data center is fundamentally just a manufacturing facility for a tool. You just can't see it.
To go back to the earlier points discussed by some of our colleagues here, stability, I think, is one of the biggest things that's both beneficial and drawback to us currently. Not only with the swinging of the pendulum, but the swinging of public sentiment. Right now, if you go out and look at any publication, probably for the last 30 days, you will see the entire plethora of thoughts about certain data centers and things like that, based upon facts, based upon feelings, based upon I just want to yell the loudest at the moment. And all of them, lucky enough, are valid. Because to the earlier points, we need to continue to educate our workers on that. Now, I would slightly disagree with my colleague's setup on the manufacturing, and I agree on the core of it that yes, AI data centers are producing something which is harder to get your hands on because it's not a widget. We're not making something that goes on a truck. But it circles back to the initial question we had here from Phil, I believe, on how do we get people to use technology? How do we get these desire path solutions? It's a lot easier to talk these things through when you're making some of these tools in the backyard right there. When you have the jobs, the resources, the technical expertise coming to our state as a primary exporter that allows us to have these real think tank-like environments to start developing these solutions. We're the ones who know our problems the best because we live them every day. Up until now, we haven't had the resources or the mentorship or the leadership that is technical enough to ask these questions of and receive an answer back that we may be able to actually put into use. As you develop these resources, data centers don't just drive themselves. I mean, you have to have somebody there to keep things going. We now have some technical expertise that can continue to grow and help develop that innovation so that maybe we are not always shipping everything out. Maybe we're home growing some of these solutions to fit our problems. And then someone else across the river or elsewhere may again look at North Dakota and go, that's really cool, and I like what you're doing. How can we help do that here? And we continue growing that. And finally, my biggest one on there for number 3 is going to be the resiliency. As we design these out, as our power, as our telecommunications, as our data centers and other infrastructure gets developed, we need to make sure that we are developing these resiliently to take this growth on over the next 30, 40, 50 plus years, so that we're not cutting corners today that impact us tomorrow. And that requires a large amount of capital investment, which, to the earlier points, is very difficult when the rules may change in 48 months.
Tony?
Just to stay on the subject of the data centers. It also strikes me, given the experience that I have visiting a lot of rural communities, that it can be a very asymmetric situation with interests. I mean, you might have part-time elected officials that are, or even volunteer. You might not have a CIO at your county. I would gather lots of them don't. And so the local officials and local residents don't have that direct experience with such a large, massive investment in infrastructure. So how do we ensure that the local community benefits in really positive ways and that those benefits are sustained over time? Do you think there are policy ideas that we should be thinking about? Are there guardrails? Should state or federal policymakers be thinking of this? How do we ensure that, the local communities themselves, are done right by when these come in?
I'll take a whack at that. The biggest thing that I want to keep in mind here is local control is a foundational pillar of North Dakota. It has been forever, and it continues on as far as I can see. So we want to make sure that whatever policy we type to generate doesn't remove the local voice from the critical portion of this discussion that it needs to be in. If we're removing locals from the discussion, we're removing the pillar of what we've built. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're not making policy in a reactive moment. If someone is already looking to build a data center and we want to make policy saying, I don't like this idea, not in my backyard, we've already failed our status of standing in front of our constituents. That being said, it's very difficult to understand in a smaller town if someone's going to come build a multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar data center. So having resources available in that form of collaboration we've built on so heavily, to me, is critical. These problems have been solved in numerous places throughout the United States and throughout the world. It's up to us as citizens, as elected officials, as appointed people, to educate ourselves on what these new potentials are and making sure that we are there to protect our citizens and their needs and the interests of our areas, while at the same time supporting development and the continued growth of our economies that these solutions can bring in. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure our heads aren't in the sand until it's too late. We sort of control our own destiny here in many ways, and that's up to us to do.
Yeah, I think, Tony, to your point, I mean, two things, I think. One is fundamentally there are others in a similar position you can lean on, right? And so that sharing of opportunities of small communities, I mean, to find places who are in a similar position and hope that they'll share those experiences that they have. In our space, I would say, in the electric utility space, where in the scheme of things, we are a relatively small utility. I have a whole series of colleagues across the country who are going through a similar thing that I can lean on, right? So that cooperation, if you will, around the pitfalls that others have faced has proven extremely valuable to us as we think about how do we describe those things. And then I think I would argue that if you are, and I'll just use the AEI data center, you have to recognize when you go into, in particular, small communities, that you may also have to help them educate, help them become educated even on their own county policies or how that works or what the opportunities are to be able to operate in that space. Because your point is a valid one. They are not fundamentally, they've never faced it before, right? So you have to recognize this is not working with, I mean, even your point about most of these places don't have even paid staff, depending on how rural you're talking about. And so you as the developer, have to recognize you have to also help them figure out where they're going. Because if you don't, you get exactly what just got described as the response is to just say no. Right, it's too difficult and it causes too many challenges. And so I think a portion of it, and I hope this is what's being learned, I'll call it on the data center development side, in this particular example as we're using is a recognition that you're bringing something that people don't appreciate, they don't necessarily even understand, and back to where does it even fit and have value. Right, so you're starting from a deficit, and then you have a structural deficit in that you have individuals who fundamentally don't. I would share with you, and this is not a data center story, but is an infrastructure story. where we were working on trying to get some infrastructure developed. And not, again, try not to be critical, but use as an example a county commission who fundamentally didn't actually even understand what it meant to operate under Robert's Rules of Order. Right, basic things about how do you engage people who are coming in to want to talk to the county about their particular concerns, and how do you run a meeting, and how do you do some basic functions. So to your point, there's an education piece, and you hope that what you can do as the individuals coming into that is to provide that basic foundation and to recognize the deficit. Right, that is one thing I think that isn't always universally understood.
Go ahead, Todd.
Maybe just a quick comment on these data centers. So DCN is a data center operator in the state of North Dakota. We have 2 Tier 3 hardened facilities, one in Bismarck, one in Fargo, that can withstand F4 tornadoes. 2 megawatts and 2 acres is our scale, and we think that's a pretty big deal. The scale and the scope of these AI hypercenter or hyperscale data centers is 100 times that. 200 acres and 200 megawatts minimum. I was just down at the APLD facility in Ellendale, and that's the one that's gotten the most progress in the state so far. Not only do they have that footprint that I just mentioned, about 200 acres and 200 megawatts, they have 6 more, maybe 8 more miles of land to the west that they could continue to build out that campus. So there isn't anybody in the infrastructure spectrum that understood or comprehended that type of scale in a data center market and opportunity. And so being able to react to that, do the right things, not only just locally, I think APLD is a prime example of how they can make it right with the community, just what they're doing with the housing and the recreational things and the things they can do right for the 1,000 or so citizens in Ellendale while this thing is being constructed. There's a lot of lessons learned from that one as the first one taking foot here in North Dakota.
Yeah. We're out of time, but I just want to take the prerogative of raising, an issue that I think, when you look at the business model and who's taking the risk, you're hearing a lot about co-ops, you're hearing a lot about members, and you're hearing a lot about these boards basically being innovative, and they are. But there's a lot of talk in the investment community right now about the AI build-out being a bubble, and that there will be a ton of infrastructure that's built, a ton of investment that's going to get stranded. And in this situation, when it's in rural America, and most of these are in rural places, who takes the risk of stranded investment, of a build-out that then to your point, Mac, you got 30 years to pay for it. What happens when there is no load growth at the end of the day, and now you're paying, for this excess build-out? And that'll have to be the last question, if you could be really quick. But I think we really need to raise that as a potential, and how rural America protects itself.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it is one we've already tackled. To your point, we have said we will not put what I call our legacy members, those people who made us, at risk, right? So if you think about, as we think about this development build out, we're not going to put our other members at risk as it relates to it, meaning that the data center needs or the developer, wherever that case may be, will have to come to the table with the capital necessary to do so. Because to your point, if I look at, and I'll pick on the applied data center in Harwood, which is a $3 billion building. That's not the infrastructure going inside the thing. That's just the building around it. My total net balance sheet is 1.8, right? So even if I were really bullish and said, I think this is the greatest thing you've ever seen since sliced bread, and I think we're going to put everything we have at risk associated with it, there is no bank, including my friend Tom, who's going to lend me the ability to do that on the balance sheet that we have. So there is a recognition here somewhere as well that even if you thought it was the best thing you've ever done, that there's a limit to what the capacity for the community or the utility or the individuals who are participating in that. And that, when you get to people who have trillion-dollar balance sheets, you have to reset your mindset when you think about that as well. Right? Even if I wanted to do it all, I couldn't.
Yeah, I'll be very brief on this. So we've taken a stab at engineering and designing a network that would support AI data centers in the state, and put a price tag on what that would cost. And we've floated quotes to various folks, and 0 bites, just for the folks that would want to use it. So there's got to be some other mechanisms for funding, untapped as we know them quite yet. The other challenge that I would throw out there is the hyperscale AI data center industry is very keen on carrier diversity. So we have 0 carriers in North Dakota that can supply this, and now these companies are asking for 2 to build similar infrastructure to serve their needs because they want diversity, not just from one provider. They want 2 providers. So now you're asking 2 companies to take a risk and an investment, and that just doesn't seem plausible right now.
Terrific. I want to thank the panelists. They've been absolutely terrific, but I also want to thank the commission members who have been so engaged. So thank you. We're going to take a quick 7-minute break. Please be back because we want to stay on time as best we can.